Hey Finxters! Today let us discuss how to check if a variable is an integer or not. So what do I mean by that? Suppose you have couple of variables in a program A and B. A has an integer value 25 while B has a decimal value 25.5. So how will you check whether A is an integer or not and if B is also an integer or not? So that's the purpose of this video. Now the methods that we are going to use to check if the variable is an integer or not are the instance method. We will also discuss why we should not use the type function to check if a variable is an integer or not. Then we move on to discuss the isInteger method. Then we discuss the round method to check if the variable is an integer. Then we will discuss how to check the variable is an integer using a modulo operator. We then move on to a very funny way of checking this, try and except block. And then finally we will discuss about the isDigit method. So without further delay, let us dive into the solutions one by one. The first method that we shall be discussing is the isInstance method. Now what's an isInstance method? So as you can see on the screen, that's the syntax for the isInstance method. The isInstance method is a built-in method in Python which returns true when the specified object is an instance of the specified type. Otherwise, it will return false. Now that might sound a little confusing, so let me help you with an example. So as you can see on the screen, we have a class by the name Finxter. Inside the class we have a variable name which has the value Python. Now we create an object of the class Finxter by the name obj, and then we use the isInstance method to check if obj or the object is an instance of the class Finxter. Then we have another example where we have a string, and using the isInstance method we check if this string is an instance of a string class or a float class or an integer class. So from this example you can see that the class info can be either a type of class or a tuple of types of classes. So that means we can check if the value or the object belongs to one of the classes within the tuple. As in this example, we have string, float, and integer class. So let's check the output. Now that will be true. We know that since object obj is obviously an instance of the class Finxter, and also hello Finxter is a string value. Now let me remove string class from here, and then this should result in false. Now let's check this out, and as you can see now it's false because hello Finxter is a string and it is not a float or an integer value. So now that we know what is the usage of the isInstance method, let us use it to check if the variable given is an integer or not. So let us consider we have a variable a which has the value 25, and then we check if a is instance of an integer class. So isInstance, then we pass our variable a which has the value 25, and then we check if it is a part of the integer class, that's int. Now let's check, and as you can see it is indeed a part of the integer class. Now let's suppose we have another variable which has a value of 40.25. Now this is a float value or a decimal value. Now let's check if this is an instance of the integer class, which should return false, and if it does so, then this is the proper method to check if the value or the variable has an integer value or not. Oops, I made an error. I passed A again, I should pass B. Now let's check. And as you can see, it's false because B is a float value. Now how to check the type of B? Print. Now we use the type method and then we print B. So as you can see, B belongs to the float class. Similarly, let's check the type of A. And as you can see, A belongs to the integer class. Now you might be thinking we can also use type to check if the variable is an integer or not. Yes, we can, but we should not use type. Now let me tell you why so. You should avoid using type because in case you have a subclass that is an integer, then type won't register the value of the variable as an integer. So that can be a little confusing. So let us have a look at an example to understand what I mean. Let me clear out the screen for you. Suppose we have a class by the name test and it is a subclass of the integer class. That means the base class is integer. This means test will inherit all the properties of the integer class. Now let's simply use pass because we do not want to do anything with this. Now let's create a variable x. Now let's print or check the output of type of x equals int. Now based on what we saw before, this should be true because class test inherits all the properties of the integer class. Therefore, x, which is an object of the class test, should also inherit the properties of the integer class and the output of the print statement should be true. But is that the case? Let's check. No, it isn't. Why so? Let's check the type of x. So as you can see, x is still a type of the class test. So this is why you should avoid using type. Now we do have a probable workaround for this issue. We can use the subclass method, which is a built-in function in Python that checks if a given class or an object is a subclass of another specified class. So let's have a look at that in action. We use the isSubclass method. Then we have type x and we check if it is a subclass of the integer class. Now let's check if this returns true. And as you can see, now it returns true. However, remember, it is always advisable to avoid using type to check whether the variable is an integer or not. The best practice would be to use the IsInstance method. Now that brings us to the next method that we are going to use, the isInteger method. It is important to understand that an integer represents only an integer value. However, a float represents numbers that can be integers like 25.0 as well as decimal numbers like 25.75. So we can use the isInteger method to check if the float value represents an integer or a decimal value. So to do that, let us quickly have a look at a program. Consider we have a variable a which has a value 25.0. We also have another variable which has the value 25.25. Now we will be using the isClass method to check if the values are integers or not. So a dot is integer. Similarly, we check the same for b as well. Now let's check what's the output. So as you can see, in the first case a is 25, so it returns true. However, b is a decimal value, so it returns false. Now let's discuss the round method to check if the value of the variable is an integer or not, or the variable is an integer or not. However, before that, let me remind you that the round method in Python returns the nearest integer when no values are passed to the optional digit argument. So you might be thinking, what's the digit argument? So let me show that to you. Suppose we have these variables. Suppose b has 2, 5, 7, 5, 8. And now we want to round b such that round up to 4 decimal places. Now let's check what happens. So as you can see, since I used 4, therefore the variable b was rounded up to 4 decimal places. Now let's round it off to 2 decimal places and let's check. As you can see, it rounded the value to 2 decimal places, so 25.26. However, when no value will be passed on to this optional digit argument, round will return the nearest integer. So what do I mean by that? Let me show that to you. Now I simply pass the variable b to the round function and I do not provide the digit argument, which is optional. So let's check what's the output. So as you can see, it's 25. Now we can use this property to check if the value is an integer or not. So how can we do that? Let's have a look. To do that, let's create a function that would make things easier for us. I'll name it isInt. Then we pass the values. And now we have an if statement which checks if the value passed to the function is equal to round of value. So what I'm doing is using the if statement to check whether the passed value is equal to the value when it is rounded. And now I do not pass the digit argument here, so it will round off the value to the nearest integer. So if it's true, let's print that to be true. Otherwise, let's print it's false. So that's it. Now we have our variables here and we have to call the function and pass the values one by one. So we first pass a and in the second case we pass b. So let's check if this works. So as you can see, we have the correct output. Since a is an integer value, it prints true, and b is not an integer value, so it prints false. I hope you get the idea or the working principle behind this program. Let me further explain it to you. In this part, when we pass the value of a, it checks if 25 is equal to 25. However, when we pass b, it checks if 25.25758 is equal to 25, which is false. Thus, we get the output as false in the second case. So I hope this method was clear to you. Now we will discuss a quick hack using the modulo method. Now please remember, I mentioned that this is just a quick workaround, and this method should not be considered as your first choice while checking if a variable is an integer or not. However, let me show that to you as well, how to use the modulo operator and check if the variable is an integer. We will use the same function. However, we will check if value mod 1 equals 0. If yes, then print true, else print false. Now let's check if this works. And as you can see, it does work. That brings us to the next method that we are going to discuss. Instead of checking if the variable is an integer or not, we initially consider that it is indeed an integer. And if it is not, then we catch the exception. Now this might sound a little confusing, so let's have a look at that in the program. Let's clear out the screen. Let us define a function again. Let me name it IsInt again. We pass a value to this function. Then we have our try block. And let's also define the except block. So inside the try block, we check if the value after being typecasted to an integer type is equal to the value itself, as we did in the case of the modulo operator previously. Then we print, or let us return, the output. So if the try block is executed, then it should return true. Otherwise, it should move in to the except block, and let us define a value error, and we simply return false using the false keyword. Now let's create a couple of variables. Let it be 25 and let that be a string in our case. I'll tell you why I did this. So let's print the output when the variable a is passed inside the function IsInt, and also let us print the output when the variable b is passed into the function IsInt. Let's check the output. So as you can see, we have true and a false value. Now instead of passing Finxter in the variable b, let us pass a different value. Now this is an integer string. What do I mean by that? It is a string, however it holds an integer value. Now let's check the output. So as you can see, it still yields the output to be false. Now you might say, what if I want to check whether the value inside a string is an integer or not? Is there a way to do that? Of course, we do have a way. Now that brings us to the last method that we will be using or discussing today. It's the isDigit method. So as the name suggests, the isDigit method returns true if all the characters present in the string are digits. Otherwise, it returns false. Now before showing you how this works, let me alert you that it only works if the string or the variable holds a value which is an integer string, or it only consists of digits. So if you think you'll pass something like Finxter or something else inside the string, it won't work for you. And the second point is isDigit always returns false for negative integers. So you cannot use it to check if a value is an integer or not if it's a negative value. So I'll be showing that to you as well so that it's clear to you. Let's move into our programming screen. Now let's keep our function and remove the function body, and let's return value, or for that sake str, which is our string class, and then we use the isDigit method and check if the value is a digit or not, and then we return the output. So now we have couple of variables a, b, and just to make things crystal clear for you, let's define another variable which has the value Finxter, and then yet again another variable which has a negative integer. So as you can see, the value b is an integer string, or a string that has an integer value or digits for that sake. Then we have c, which is a complete string and has no digits in it. And then we have d, which has a negative integer in it as a string. Since we are checking for integer values, let me change a to something like this, a decimal value like 25.75. We also need to pass the other variables to the function, so let me quickly do that. C and D. Now our expected output in the first case is false because this is a decimal value. In the second case it should return true. The third case should return false. However, in the fourth case it should also return true, because though 25 is negative, however it's still an integer. That's why I mentioned that isDigit returns false for negative integers, and you cannot use it to check if the value is a negative integer or not. So let's check the output. So as you can see, we have the expected output. True for the second case and false in every other case. Now that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you learned something from it. Please give it a like and subscribe our channel, and do not forget to hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as the next video comes up. Goodbye.